My name is Polly Higgins. I am an international lawyer specialising in ecocide crime, and my organisation is called Ecological Defence Integrity.
And what does Ecological Defence Integrity do, and what do you do?
Yeah, we are legally advising on ecocide crime to become an international crime at the International Criminal Court. That entails a whole raft of levels of engagement. Usually it tends to be politically with countries that are engaging with this as a potential issue to stop and abate their ecocides. Majority are wanting to engage in it because of climate ecocide.
And could you just give a quick kind of definition or description of what ecocide is?
Sure, ecocide is the extensive damage, destruction to or loss of ecosystems.
Could you maybe explain, why you're trying to get this law in place and, what that means for particular actors?
Yeah. Why we're wanting to get this law in place is that there's a deficit. Existing law it does not go far enough in terms of stopping serious harm, ecological harm and climatic harm. Existing environmental regulations are very basic, very low level, and we're now looking at atrocity levels of damage and destruction that are going unimpeded and unaddressed through the criminal legal system. For us, it's very important that this is addressed at the international criminal level, because often these crimes are playing out transboundary at an international level as well.
Sure. And who's going to potentially find themselves on, the other side of this? So if on the one hand you've got these kind of small state actors, who presumably are going to be pushing this, who's going to be on the other side of that?
So as with any crime, you're looking at the perpetrators. Who are the perpetrators? That's individuals. We're talking about criminal law here. So you're identifying in international criminal law persons of superior responsibility. So it's the senior officials of corporations. It can also be the senior officials of governments as well. So you're looking at CEOs, directors, ministers, heads of state, who can be held to account within an international criminal court.
And, we've been speaking before about the work you're doing, particularly around Shell. Can you explain what's going on with that particular piece of work and, why Shell?
Yeah, we launched in December 2018 an independent preliminary examination into the activities of Shell. One of the reasons we were looking at them is that they're a carbon major. By carbon major, we mean that they're one of the top fossil fuel companies in the world that's generating the most amount of carbon emissions. It's not just the carbon emissions we're looking at the ecological harm that's perpetuated by their activities as well as the climatic harm. We also decided that it was very important that we look at Shell. It's a European-based international company, but they have been put on notice a number of times, not just through public engagement and civil litigation, but also by their own climate scientists, that since the 1980s they've had the knowledge their activities amount to dangerous industrial activity and are helping to facilitate climate collapse.
So yeah, we just spoken there about, the fact that they knew, Shell knew, obviously is the hashtag that's been used for a lot of this stuff. Why does it matter that Shell knew? What implications are there of that? One
of the things we're examining is whether or not prosecution could be brought under existing international crimes against humanity as to whether or not this constitutes an inhumane act. To do that, to establish the elements of that crime, we have to show knowledge, their intent, if you will. And what we're looking at here is secondary intent, not primary intent. Their primary intent isn't to cause climate breakdown. Their intent inevitably is to facilitate ongoing business, if you will. However, it's moving ahead with an activity that is clearly causing serious harm, and with that knowledge continuing regardless. And that's very important, because this isn't just actually Shell, this is an industry-wide practice that we're looking at, a modus operandi, if you will. The knowledge has been there for a number of decades, right across the board, and yet these industries continued regardless.
And you just mentioned there the International Criminal Court. Could you just explain a bit what that is and what role that court plays?
Yeah. The International Criminal Court was set up. Its first case was only brought in 2004. So it's a relatively new body that was put in place under the Rome Statute. The Rome Statute is a very important legal document that brought together existing international crimes that we have: genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. And what we're saying is that there's a missing crime here with ecocide to stand alongside genocide and the other atrocity crimes. So the International Criminal Court sits in The Hague, and it brings crimes of most serious concern for humanity as a whole. And prosecutions are brought there. It is a court of last resort, however. They only step in when a country is either unwilling or unable to bring its own prosecutions on any atrocity crime.
And just mention there, you know, these countries who maybe don't normally have the ability to kind of put on this kind of pressure or take these things forward.
Exactly,
So
yeah.
who is it that are most likely to take advantage or find some benefit in this ecocide law?
Well, at the moment, our biggest ecocide that we're facing is climate ecocide, without a doubt. And of course, for small island developing states, and there are 56 small island developing states, this for them is an existential humanitarian crisis. And this is why we're also looking to see whether or not we have to test the boundaries of law as a crime against humanity. We know that millions of lives are at stake as a result of climate breakdown. We know also that this is preventable. And yet we have governments who accept the science. We know from the IPCC report that came out just in October 2018 that rapid reductions in emissions must be contained within the next 12 years. So this is the science behind the legal premise upon which we have to now bring in a law such as ecocide to become an international crime, to prohibit, prevent and preempt dangerous industrial activity that's exacerbating climate ecocide.
And we're talking about the urgency here, you know, obviously one of the organisations that's really embraced this idea of the urgency of the climate crisis are Extinction Rebellion.
Yes.
You know, coming as a lawyer, you know, obviously their main kind of modus operandi, as it were, is to break the law to make that point. What do you think about Extinction Rebellion and these kind of newer campaigns that are coming out?
Yeah, I think this is very important at this time. We've gotten to a stage where existing environmental organisations haven't managed to actually bring this onto the table in a meaningful way. We can see that NGOs have failed in that remit. We can see that countless petitions are not moving governments to take any meaningful action. And we can see that the dangerous industrial activity that's exacerbating climate change remains unabated and indeed escalating. So where are we left with but for people to get out in the streets? And if that means that they end up breaking the law, then so be it. Because remember this, these individuals are not operating out of a position of criminality. They're operating from a position of conscience. It's an act of conscience, and they're operating from a place of wanting to protect humanity as a whole against potentially what could be the largest crime against humanity we've ever had to experience.
And you've just mentioned, you know, conscience there. You know, are there comparisons we can draw kind of historically around this?
Yes, if we look back in time to the 20th century, the conscientious objectors, of course, they were first put in prison for standing up and speaking out against the serious harm that they perceived with World War I and then World War II. It took the legalising of their activities through the recognition of it being the right to freedom of conscience under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and also our European Convention of Human Rights. So Article 9 gives us the legal right to freedom of conscience to stand up, to speak out. And so in a way we're standing on the shoulders of the past to say we're standing here not just as objectors, conscientious objectors, but conscientious protectors. We're doing this to protect society, and not just society, the earth as a whole.
I wonder as well if you could explain, you know, how people can maybe use that conscientious protector kind of framework.
The campaign that we put in place is to invite people, it's a crowdfund, invite people to actually put money into our Earth Protectors Trust Fund to help fund taking ecocide law forward. That document means that you are now signed up as atrocity of the earth. And you can use that in court as documentary evidence to show that you're not just saying that you are a conscientious protector, but you're standing by what you're saying, that you are operating from your conscience, that that document itself is cogent evidence to say, I am seeking to have the law changed to protect the earth. And that's very important when one ends up in court, in particular criminal court. You have to establish with primary evidence why you're standing up for what it is you're speaking out against. And it's not necessarily the legal industry, it's the consequences of those industries. Fracking, it's the consequences, the adverse consequences of fracking. That's why you're standing up as an activist against fracking. A climate breakdown, that's the fact that fossil fuel industries, the consequences of their actions are now going to be adversely impacting many, many generations to come. And this is very important because it's actually addressing the consequences of activities, and activities that are ultimately preventable. And preventable when we put in place a law to criminalise it.
I guess, one of my final questions then would be, why does this matter?
There's a very pragmatic reason for that. We can't continue operating the way we are. Let it continue and ultimately everything will be destroyed. So it's pragmatic. We stop that now. We outlaw that which is dangerous. We recognise it as a crime and draw that legal red line in the sand and say enough, no more. Just as we did with genocide, apartheid, and now with ecocide. But there's also there's a higher reason. In a way, what we're doing is we're realigning law with higher law. And natural law says first, do no harm. And that's really what ecocide law is all about. It's a first do no harm principle that underpins it, to prevent what could be the most catastrophic disaster of our time.